Here is something no one taught you in school. Before 1900, the buildings we called hospitals looked nothing like what we have today. Nothing. They were not sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors with linoleum floors and beeping machines. They were not the anxious, transactional spaces we now associate with illness. They were something else entirely. Vast, ambitious, over-engineered in ways that make no sense if you only accept what you've been told about what they were for. And then, within a single generation, almost every single one of them was gone. Not renovated, not repurposed. Gone, demolished, replaced, erased quietly, systematically, and almost universally across dozens of countries within the same narrow window of time. The official explanation says this was progress. The deeper you look, the more that explanation begins to collapse. Let's start with what we are told. We are told that pre-1900 hospitals were primitive, dangerous, infection-ridden charity wards where the poor went to die, tended by well-meaning but ignorant practitioners working in the dark before science arrived to turn on the lights. We're told that as medicine advanced, as germ theory was established, as clinical rigor replaced folk intuition, these old buildings were naturally superseded. The modern hospital emerged because the modern hospital was better. Progress. Evolution, the inevitable triumph of rational thought over superstition. That's the story. Here is the first problem with it. If these buildings were simply inferior, badly designed, poorly ventilated, structurally inadequate, the transition would have been gradual, uneven, regional. You would expect some cities to hold on longer, some administrators to resist, some buildings to be repurposed, converted, adapted. You would expect the historical record to contain arguments, debates. At minimum, some documented disagreement between the people who had spent their careers in these institutions and the people telling them the institutions were obsolete. Almost none of that exists. What exists instead is silence on one side and rubble on the other. Consider the buildings themselves, because the official story relies heavily on you not looking too closely at them. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded, according to official records, in the 7th century, making it among the oldest continuously operating hospitals in the world. The version standing in the 19th century was a cathedral-like complex occupying the Isle de la Cité, its arched corridors and vaulted interior chambers drawing comparison to the great ecclesiastical architecture of medieval Europe. It was demolished and rebuilt beginning in 1878. The old structure, centuries of accumulated architectural knowledge, was gone within years. The Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, founded in 1751, was among the first purpose-built medical institutions in the Americas. Its original building was a model of what its founders called moral architecture, the deliberate use of space, proportion, and environment to produce conditions favorable to healing. By the early 20th century, its operational philosophy had been comprehensively dismantled and replaced. The Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, Bedlam as it was colloquially known, was so architecturally ambitious that visitors crossed from continental Europe simply to walk its halls, not to study its patients, to study its building. That building was moved, rebuilt, the original structure repurposed for something else entirely. The Royal Edinburgh Asylum, the Groote Schuur in Cape Town, the São João de Deus in Porto, the Charité in Berlin, across every continent where Western infrastructure had taken hold by the mid-19th century, the pattern repeats. These were not modest stone structures. They were massive, ornate, over-engineered, and they were over-engineered in a very specific direction that the official history has almost nothing to say about. They were designed around their patient's environment. This is the detail that most accounts slide past, and it is the detail that matters most. The pre-industrial hospital was not a delivery mechanism for treatments administered to a passive body. It was, in the most literal architectural sense, an environment, a built system designed to produce specific conditions that were understood to support recovery. The orientation of the building relative to the sun, the height of the ceilings, the ratio of window area to floor space, the materials used in the walls, the flow of air through the corridors. The acoustic properties of the healing wards. These were not accidents, they were not aesthetic preferences, they were deliberate design choices made by people who understood, or believed they understood, that the body recovers differently in different environments, that space is not neutral, that what surrounds the patient is part of the treatment. Now consider what replaced them. The post-1900 hospital is architecturally indifferent to everything except efficiency of administration. The building is designed not to produce conditions favorable to healing, but to facilitate the delivery of interventions to bodies at scheduled intervals. The architecture is neutral. The substance is active. The drug does the work. The The building simply holds the patient still while it does it. This is not a minor philosophical shift. It is a complete inversion of the therapeutic model, the most fundamental rethinking of what a hospital is for that has ever occurred. And it happened, globally, within approximately 30 years, without leaving a documented debate in the historical record. No argument, no opposition, no moment of reckoning where the old model defended itself and lost. Simply before and after. Now here is where it becomes harder to look away. The timing of this architectural transition corresponds almost exactly with a set of documented institutional changes that have nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with economics. In 1910, Abraham Flexner, an educator, not a physician, published a report commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation that evaluated the state of American medical education. The Flexner Report, as it became known, condemned the majority of existing medical schools as inadequate. Its recommendations were adopted with a speed that should, in retrospect, raise questions. Within a decade, more than half of American medical schools had closed. Not a few, not the worst outliers, more than half. The schools that survived were those aligned with what we now call pharmaceutical medicine, treatment through chemical intervention, diagnosis through measurable biological markers, standardized institutional protocols. The schools that closed were, disproportionately, those teaching botanical medicine, hydrotherapy, homeopathy, naturopathy, and what the era called electrotherapy. Here is what does not make the textbooks. The foundations that funded the Flexner Report, the Carnegie Foundation, and others whose names appear consistently in this period, were simultaneously funding the lobbying for medical licensing laws that would give legal protection to the new pharmaceutical model, and funding the early pharmaceutical companies that would supply the treatment, protocols the new schools were training physicians to administer. This is not speculation, this is documented. The funding trails exist, the institutional connections are on the record. What this means is that the displacement of pre-pharmaceutical medicine was not purely a scientific event. It was also, and perhaps primarily, an economic one. The healing traditions that were displaced had one thing in common that had nothing to do with their efficacy and everything to do with their commercial viability. They were impossible to monopolize. A botanical remedy grown in a garden, a water treatment administered in a bath, a practice of structured rest in a carefully designed space. These are not products you can patent. You cannot build a supply chain around them. You cannot charge licensing fees for the knowledge of how to use them. You cannot create a captive consumer who must return to a single provider for each dose of what keeps them functional. The new system could do all of those things. And so the old system was dismantled, professionally, institutionally, and physically. The buildings came down, the schools closed. The practitioners lost their licenses, their professional standing, and eventually their successors, because without institutional homes, without training programs, without accreditation, a knowledge tradition does not survive more than 2 or 3 generations. By 1930, the infrastructure of pre-pharmaceutical medicine had been so thoroughly eliminated in the Western world that most people alive today have no idea it ever existed. Not as a vague historical curiosity, as a comprehensive, practiced, institutionally embedded alternative that had served populations for centuries. It is gone, and the question that the official history has never satisfactorily answered is, how does something that large disappear that fast, across that many countries, inside that narrow a window of time, without coordination? For the simultaneous, global demolition of pre-1900 healing infrastructure to be explained by organic historical progress, several things would need to be true at once. Physicians in Paris, London, Berlin, Vienna, New York, Buenos Aires, Bombay, and Sydney would all need to have independently reached the same conclusions about the inadequacy of their existing institutions at roughly the same time. Local governments across competing political systems, constitutional monarchies, republics, colonies, emerging democracies, would all need to have independently allocated resources for replacement on the same schedule. The architectural traditions of the old buildings would need to have been independently judged irrelevant and unworthy of preservation across all of these wildly different cultural and political contexts. And all of this would need to have happened without a coordinating body, without a central conference, without a manifesto, without a recorded agreement between any of the parties involved. The official history says yes, all of that happened independently because the ideas were correct and correct ideas spread. But correct ideas do not spread with that kind of precision across competing empires and sovereign nations within 30 years without infrastructure, without funding, without someone somewhere holding the institutional architecture of the transition together while the physical architecture of the old system came down. The funding existed. The institutional architecture existed. It existed in the form of specific, identifiable foundations that operated across national borders and whose influence on medical policy in this period is not a secret. It is simply not discussed with the seriousness the scale of the transition demands. What was lost in this transition is genuinely difficult to assess because the loss was designed to be total. Not the knowledge of specific treatments, not the records of particular practitioners, the infrastructure of the tradition itself, the buildings, the schools, the professional networks, the accumulated institutional memory that allows a practice to be transmitted across generations, was dismantled so comprehensively that what survives exists only in fragments. In archives that have not been digitized, in the journals of administrators whose facilities were demolished within years of the writing, in the memoirs of patients who described recoveries that, by the standards of their era's emerging clinical science, should not have happened. And in the buildings themselves, the few that survive. Because there are buildings still standing, on the edges of what the official architectural history of the 19th century can explain, buildings with acoustic properties that exceed any functional justification under their stated use, buildings with sub-basement levels documented in original plans but described in city records as having been filled in during early 20th century infrastructure upgrades. Buildings that appear in the earliest available photographs already worn, already settled, already ancient in ways that their official construction dates cannot account for. The old hospitals, the ones demolished in the 1880 to 1910 window, fit this pattern more often than the record acknowledges. Buildings for which operating records exist, patient intake, staff rosters, supply invoices, but for which no construction records have been located. Buildings that appear in city directories fully operational, without a documented moment of having been built. What does this mean? I genuinely do not know. I am not making a claim about what it means. I am describing what is there when you go looking, which is not the same thing. What I am prepared to say is this. The transition that occurred between approximately 1880 and 1920 was not simply a medical revolution. It was a wholesale replacement of one model of human healing with another, a replacement that was architectural, educational, professional, legal, and economic simultaneously, and that happened at a speed and scale of coordination that the official explanation of spontaneous intellectual progress cannot adequately account for. Something was understood by the people who built the old institutions that is not understood, or not practiced, or not permitted by the institutions that replaced them. Whether that understanding was primitive intuition dressed in architectural ambition, or something more precise, more technical, more intentionally designed than we have been taught to consider, is a question the record does not settle. What the record does show is that the replacement was not merely practical. It was thorough. The buildings came down, the schools closed, the practitioners lost standing, and the knowledge, whatever form it actually took, was scattered, dispersed into fragments held by researchers working in isolation, finding each other slowly, decades later, asking questions that the mainstream history of medicine has shown almost no curiosity in answering. I want to leave you with not an answer but a shape. The shape of a 30-year window. A synchronized, global, architecturally specific, educationally thorough, professionally comprehensive, economically legible replacement of one system with another. The shape of a transition that left no debate in the record, only a before and an after, separated by rubble and silence. The shape of a question that the people best positioned to investigate it, historians of medicine, architectural historians, institutional economists, have, with very few exceptions, declined to ask in full. Why? That question, not what was lost, not when, not even how, but why someone needed it gone, and why the institutions that replaced it have shown so little curiosity about what they replaced, is the question I cannot stop asking. The old hospitals are gone. What they knew, if they knew something, went with them, and the system built to replace them was built, among other things, to make sure you would never think to go looking. Once you see the shape of it, you can't unsee it.